Hi everyone. According to Geoffrey of Monmouth, in King Arthur's time there was a powerful king of Dyfed called Stater, but he doesn't seem to appear in any other records. So who was he? Can we identify him from other records as a well-attested king of that period? Or was he just an invention of Geoffrey of Monmouth? Well, let's take a look at the evidence, okay? So, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, during Arthur's special coronation ceremony well into his reign, after his Saxon battles, he had a special ceremony in which he had 4 powerful kings of Britain stand before him. One of them was Stater, the king of Dyfed. Given the context, it's clear that he's one of the most powerful kings of his time, and his kingdom was Dyfed. Yet when we look at the king lists of Dyfed from the medieval records, there's no trace of Stater in Arthur's time, and there's also no reference to Stater in any of the historical narrative records like the Lives of the Saints or anything like that. This seems to just be an invention on Geoffrey's part. Some people say that Geoffrey took this name, Stater, from the Harleyan genealogies. In the Harleyan genealogies, we do find basically the same name, and it seems to be adapted from a Roman title, Stator. But there's a big problem with this. This name, as it appears in the Harleyan genealogies, comes well before Magnus Maximus, and Geoffrey knew who Magnus Maximus was. He wrote about him. So it's inconceivable that Geoffrey would have taken this name, which he could see came before Magnus Maximus, and applied it to a king of Dyfed in Arthur's time, which was several generations after the time of Magnus Maximus. If Geoffrey had wanted to just take a name from these genealogies and use it for this character, this king of Dyfed in Arthur's time, several generations after Magnus Maximus, then he logically would have used a name from the genealogies that appears several names after Magnus Maximus. There is absolutely no coherent reason for why he would have chosen a name prior to Magnus Maximus for this supposedly fictional character. There is no logical reason for that whatsoever. So it just doesn't work as an explanation, even though it is very, very regularly proposed as the explanation for this figure of Stater. It just doesn't work. So what is the explanation? Well, first, it would be helpful to identify who he really was, and then perhaps we can work out why Geoffrey called him Stater. Now, to work out who he was, it's actually not that difficult, because we can just look at the Welsh versions of Geoffrey's account and see how they understood this. It's very, very useful in many cases to look at how the Welsh understood and adapted and explained Geoffrey's account, because often they preserve or they clear up some issues that appear in Geoffrey's version. So when we look at these Welsh versions and we look at the account in which Stater appears, we find that his name is not given as Stater. His name is actually given as Meurig, Meurig, king of Dyfed. So that is very, very helpful. The problem though is that according to Peter Bartram in his Welsh Classical Dictionary, he claims that there are no other historical or legendary references to a king of Dyfed called Meurig at this time. And it's definitely true that Meurig doesn't appear in any of the king lists of Dyfed. However, here's something that we need to bear in mind. Now this is a very, very crucial fact. The word or the place name Dyfed did not just apply to the kingdom of Dyfed in southwest Wales. It was also sometimes used to refer to South Wales as a whole, South Wales in general. We see this, for example, in the Life of St Cadoc, where the region of Glywysing, or in other words Glamorgan, is said to have been in Dyfed. Another example is in the Brychan documents, where Brycheiniog is said to have been in Dyfed. Again, that's not southwest Wales. That's in the southeastern corner. Another example is found in Geoffrey's own work. In his account of the founding of Gloucester, he explains that this city was near the border of Dyfed, or Demetia as he calls it, and Loegr, which is his name for England. So when we look at that on a map, it's clear that he's referring to the division between England and Wales. So that explanation, that description only makes sense if we accept Dyfed or Demetia as a reference to South Wales as a whole, because otherwise it doesn't border England at all. It's nowhere near Gloucester. The Kingdom of Dyfed in southwest Wales doesn't fit Geoffrey's description at all. Whereas, if we take it to mean South Wales as a whole, then his description makes perfect sense. His description requires that. And that's also shown clearly by the references in the life of St. Cadoc and the Brecon documents. Dyfed meant not just the Kingdom of Dyfed in southwest Wales, but the region of South Wales as a whole. So, was there a king of South Wales, not necessarily in the Kingdom of Dyfed, but somewhere in South Wales, was there a king, a powerful king, called Meurig in the Arthurian period? Well, if you follow the early chronology of the Athrois dynasty, then the answer would be yes. So if you're not familiar, Athrois is a very popular candidate for the historical King Arthur. I believe he was the historical King Arthur, and so do many others. His father was Meurig, but according to most scholars, and this is a fairly modern idea, Athrois was a 7th century king. He lived a whole century after King Arthur, so his father Meurig would not have been in a position chronologically to be the Stater King of Dyfed in the Arthurian period during Arthur's special coronation ceremony. However, there are other scholars, and I support this view, that this dynasty should actually be dated 100 years earlier than it generally is today. This is the traditional view, by the way. So that would place Meurig in the 6th century in exactly the right time to be the Stater who appears as the King of Dyfed in Geoffrey's account, and therefore he fits well with the Meurig King of Dyfed in the Welsh versions of Geoffrey's account. There's no other Meurig who's available to be the Meurig of this account. So if you accept the more popular late chronology for this dynasty, then the legendary Meurig King of Dyfed is just inexplicable. But if you accept the early, more traditional chronology of this dynasty, then it's easily explainable. Meurig King of Dyfed is Meurig, the father of Athrois, Meurig ap Tudrig. But there is one little remaining question. Why does Geoffrey call him Stater? Well, the generally accepted idea is that this is an adaptation of the Latin title Stator, and since the Welsh versions give him a different name, the name Meurig, this supports the idea that this was meant to be a title. But why? What does it mean? Well, to the Romans, a Stator was the attendant of a magistrate, often serving as a messenger. And the actual etymology of the word refers to the idea of standing, conveying the idea of a servant standing by the side of the person whom they served. And we know that Latin titles continued to be used in Britain in the 6th century because of contemporary inscriptions. So could it be that Meurig was called a Stater because he served as an attendant or a messenger for King Arthur? Well, it's interesting. If we look at the Book of Llandaff, we find something very interesting. So the Book of Llandaff presents a very, very large quantity of land grants, with a king granting land to the church as a kind of donation. And there's often witness lists of the clergy and the laity. Now, in most cases, the king is described as presenting this gift of land to the church. But in this very rare case in which Athrois, the candidate for King Arthur, is said to have given land to the church, we find this really interesting statement near the beginning. King Meurig on behalf of his son Athrois. So we see here that in the actual presentation of the land to the church, Athrois is not present, but he has his father, King Meurig, represent him to give the donation of land. Now, to be clear, this wasn't a normal arrangement. This is, unless I'm mistaken, this is the only instance of this in the entire Book of Llandaff. So this was an unusual arrangement. We have King Meurig representing his son Athrois to give this donation to the church. So, in a sense, he's acting like a messenger for his son Athrois. Now, doesn't that tie in so well with the idea of Meurig being Stater, Stater being the description, the Latin title for someone serving as a messenger or representative of a Roman ruler, with his son Athrois, the person who in the Book of Llandaff he represents, being King Arthur. Doesn't that fit so nicely? Whereas if we reject this chronology, or this early chronology of Meurig's dynasty, then the identity of Stater is a mystery, it's inexplicable. The Welsh identified him with Meurig, but which Meurig? There's no other Meurig it could be. And why is he called a Stater? Unless he's representing King Arthur, but he doesn't represent King Arthur in Geoffrey's account any more than the other three kings. It's all very inexplicable, it doesn't really make any sense. But when we accept Athrois as King Arthur, and we consider this description in the Book of Llandaff of Meurig representing Athrois, then that all makes sense. Meurig served, on occasion at least, as the representative of his son, essentially as a messenger, so he was the Stater of King Arthur, and that is why Geoffrey of Monmouth refers to Meurig, King of Dyfed, as Stater, because that was essentially his Roman title. Now here's another interesting question. Did the Minoan eruption on the island of Thera, or Santorini, in ancient times really lead to the collapse of the Minoan civilization, as many online sources claim, or is that just a modern misinterpretation? Well, come back next time to find out the answer.